This is 9.2, solving quadratic equations by factoring. Last lesson we learned solving quadratic equations by graphing. Remember, solving an equation is finding the solution or solutions that make the equation true. That's what solving means. And quadratic equations are equations with an exponent of a 2. So we're solving quadratic equations, but we're going to do it by a different method called factoring. We've already been talking about how to factor polynomials for quite some time. So let's get into this. One of the properties that you guys learned back way back in elementary school, it's actually called the zero product property. So this property is something that you guys have already learned over and over and over. Basically, you guys learned anything times 0 is 0. Well, the zero product property says if A times B equals 0. So if you have this right here, A times B equals 0, then what do you know about A and B? Well, one of them or both of them have to be 0. I mean, they have to be. The only way when I multiply, like if A is 5 and this is 2, 5 times 2, that doesn't equal 0. But if this is 3 times 9, that doesn't equal 0. One of these, to equal 0, one of these has to be 0. Like this could be 5, this could be 0. Or this could be 0 and this could be negative 10. You know, one of them has to be 0 when you multiply together. If the result is 0, then one of them has to equal 0. Has to be. So focus on when you're multiplying two things together, if one of them, if the result is 0, that means one of them has to be 0. Has to be. So let's look at this example right here. So if I had 2x equals 0, well, we know how to solve the equation, but I also know, see, I'm multiplying two things together, and I know the result is 0. That means one of them has to be 0. Well, 2 is not 0, which means x has to be 0. Has to be. If I have negative 8 times x times y times m, I don't know what x is. I don't know what y is. I don't know what m is. They can be any number in the world, but if I know the result equals 0, that means one of those variables, it could be x, it could be y, or it could be m, but one of them has to be 0. Now, two of them could be 0, or all three of them could be 0, but one of them has to be 0. So that's something I want you to consider. Now, again, we can't solve this equation, but we do know one of them has to be 0 for right now. So let's look at it like this. So if we're trying to find what x is on this, I want to emphasize, when you have two things multiplied together, I have this and I have this. I have two things multiplied together and the result equals 0. Well, that means one of those things, whether this one equals 0 or this one equals 0, one of them has to equal 0. So to solve this, you're going to get x equals negative 3. So whether x equals 0 or x equals negative 3. And again, if you substituted 0 in back to the equation, it would give you 0. If you substituted negative 3 right here, if you substituted negative 3 right here and right there, so that would be negative 3 times negative 3 plus 3. And see, you would get 0. 0 does equal 0. So this works, and so does this. So you can literally check them, what will make it 0. Again, I have two things multiplied together. This times this. It's the zero product property. Whenever you have two things multiplied together and the result is 0, that means one of these has to equal 0. And so you're just going to set them equal to 0, and you're going to solve. So x could be to negative 7. Or x could equal 1/2. Again, those are my two possible answers that make the equation true. And again, to check them, if you plug negative 7 in to both of these x's, so you literally, you put negative 7 plus 7, and 2 times negative 7 minus 1, you're going to get 0 times negative 15, which the result will be 0. So this works. Again, the same thing. If you plug 1/2 back in to these equations, so 1/2 plus 7 and 2 times 1/2 minus 1. You're going to get 7.5 here. You're going to get 1 minus 1. And anything times 0 is 0. So this one works out as well. You can easily check your answers. It will make it 0. Same thing. The 0 property says, anything times, if you have two things multiplied together and the result equals 0, then one of these has to equal 0. So you set this equal to 0, and you set this equal to 0, and you literally solve both of these. So you're going to add 8, divide by 3, so x is 8/3, so 8/3 is a 0. It will make it equal to 0, and then minus 2, minus 2. So x equals 2/5. So these are my two solutions that will make it equal to 0. Again, I want to emphasize the 0 product property when you have two things multiplied together and the result equals 0, not any other number. If that equals 5 or equals 20, it will work. I mean, it has to equal 0. That's what the product rule says. The 0 product rule says when you have two things multiplied together, the result is 0. One of them has to equal 0. So let's start solving quadratic equations, and we're going to actually solve them by factoring. So again, I want to emphasize the 0 product property. I've said it several times already. It has to equal 0. So what I want to do to solve this is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this equal 0. Right now it says equal -20. So I'm going to add 20 to both sides. And factoring is going to play a huge role into using that 0 product property. If I factored this trinomial, notice I have something times something equals 0. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find two things multiplied together, the result equals 0. So if I factor this, remember when it has a 1 out front, you find two numbers that multiply together, that gives you the last number, and also adds together to give you the middle number. So these two numbers would be +4 and then +5. And then all you have to do from there is, again, I have something times something equals 0. That means one of these has to equal 0. So you're going to take x plus 4 equals 0, and you're going to solve it. So x equals -4. X equals -5. And again, one way to check this, if I take the equation x squared plus 9x plus 20, actually, you know what we should do? We probably should plug it into the original problem. That is the same problem, but you should always plug it into the original problem, like the very beginning problem. So 9 times blank, and it should equal -20. So if I put -4 right here, I'm checking -4 to see if it works. So this is +16, and this is -36. And I add those together, I'm going to get -20, and -20 does equal -20. So this works. And if I do the same thing with -5, so -5 squared. And again, I'm just checking. This is my check work. You're trying to find out what will equal -20, and you're checking your answers. So this is 25, this is -45, this equals -20, and that does equal -20, so this works as well. That's one way to do it as well. One way to, again, what we learned last section is you could, if you actually graph this function, remember what these mean. These are called zeros. If I graph this, this is where it actually hits the x line at. These are your x-intercepts. So if I graphed it, that's where it would cross the x line at. But again, you could solve by factoring. That's what this lesson is about. So here, again, if I solve by factoring, we're going to, again, go through the process. factor this. Two things multiplied together to equal 0. So again, this is x times x. What times what is 64? It adds together to be 16. So this would be x plus 8 and x plus 8. And again, you're going to solve this. There's no reason to repeat this one because it would be the same as that. So there's only one solution. It's x equals -8 on this. And again, if I solve this, remember, it has to equal 0. So I'm going to minus 64 from both sides first. Try to find two things multiplied together that will equal 0. Again, two numbers that multiply together to give you negative 64, and adds together to give you negative 12. So this would be negative, switch to negative 16, positive 4. Again, they multiply together to give me this, and they add together to give me that. And then you set this equal to 0, set this equal to 0, and you actually solve. X equals -4, x equals 16. And again, you can plug them back in to see if it equals positive 64. All right, so solve by factoring again on this one. Again, you want to set it equal to 0. So we're going to minus 15 from both sides. And again, just want to remind you about factoring. There's several different ways we talked about different types of factoring. This does not have a 1 in front. So we talked about different ways to factor. Most of you I showed you guys factor by grouping. And so you take it's called the factor by grouping or the AC method. So you multiply those together to be negative 30. And then you find out what times what is negative 30. So it could be, 5 times 6, could be 10 times 3, but it has to also add together to give me positive 1. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use 6 and negative 5. Those do multiply together to give me negative 30, and they add together to give me positive 1. So I'm going to literally break this up into 6x and minus 5x. And remember, anytime you have 4 terms, you're going to factor by grouping. So if you look at the first two, what's common between those is a 2x, and you're left with x plus 3. And if you look at the next two, what's common between that is a negative 5. You're going to get x plus 3. And these should always match, which they do. Now, once we factored it, the whole purpose is to factor, and you're trying to find what times what equals 0. That's what you're trying to do. That's the zero product property. When two things multiply together equals 0, one of those has to equal 0. So x plus 3 equals 0. X equals negative 3. And then 2x minus 5 equals 0. So x equals 5/2. And again, these are my two zeros that will make this equation, if you check them, that will make that equation equal to 15. And then one last problem, if you start solving this, we're going to, again, set it equal to 0. And then factor this. And something I want you to notice, this happens to be a perfect. If you notice, the first and the last terms are perfect. And so this is going to literally be 2x plus 5 and 2x plus 5. And again, two things multiplied together equals 0. That means one of these has to equal 0. And because they're identical to each other, we're just going to solve one. So x equals negative 5/2 is the only answer that will make it equal 0. Or again, if you plug it into the original problem, it's the only answer that will make it equal